I've heard this transphobic talking point recently where trans women will never be women because we were socialized male. And I mean, don't get me wrong, they tried. But what I received was not an education on how to be a boy, but rather a traumatizing campaign to convince me that my femininity was an abomination. I'm Katrina King, and this is The View from Her Side. I feel like this narrative that trans women were socialized male is not only misguided, but it's actually harmful. So let's unpack what we're actually talking about when we talk about early male socialization, and we can refer to it as the toxic masculinity starter kit. It's a fairly common thought in modern feminist discourse to say that we don't raise boys to be men, we raise boys not to be girls. And as somebody with insider information into this, I couldn't agree more. What does that mean? So you can't show your emotions except anger. Be strong, be tough, be a man, no crying, don't appear weak. Anything remotely feminine is off limits. And that ultimately leads to deviation from gender norms being ridiculed into compliance. And I believe that that concept right there is one of the root causes of transphobia and homophobia. To paraphrase Julia Serrano, the cornerstone of the patriarchy is the assumption of the superiority of masculinity. So it must logically follow that femininity is inferior. And this is where the seeds of misogyny are sown, and it leads to sexual violence. Early male socialization is one of our biggest societal failures. And as closeted trans girls, we actually get a unique lens on that, but it comes at great psychological and emotional expense. So let's look at how that affects a closeted trans girl. I've known since about age 5, but I grew up in a remote part of Canada in the 80s and 90s, and we didn't have the vocabulary to even begin describing what we were going through. All I wanted was a My Little Pony, but I got a G.I. Joe. I wanted She-Ra. I got He-Man. I didn't even get a Care Bear, and they're supposed to be unisex. But hey, at least one of them came out as trans lately. And as I'm watching my sister enjoy all of these things that I identify with, I'm also being bombarded with this toxic messaging telling me that everything that I know about myself is unacceptable. And they just keep trying and trying and trying. And there's this huge dichotomy between what we're being taught and our inner sense of self, and we're far too young to process any of the nuances of that. The entirety of that messaging is telling us that everything we know ourselves to be is repulsive. Look, I certainly don't speak for all trans women, but I've had this conversation with enough trans women, at least ones who transitioned in adulthood, to know that there's a fairly common effect that this has, and a singular word that most of us use to describe: shame. It instills a deep, dark sense of shame that absolutely consumes us unless it's addressed. It's so pervasive that I've described it in the past as the safety dance playing in my head from morning till night, day in, day out, all day, every day. And it's ultimately what leads to many of us trying to take our own lives. Let me tell you a story. Around age 12, I met a friend named Steven, and it turns out he was just like me. I think there's a very good chance we might have a Stephanie out there somewhere, but I've been unable to track them down. We quickly figured out that we have something very, very important in common. So we would lock ourselves behind closed doors, and we would wear dresses and play with girls' toys. But there was one thing that we really, really liked to do, and it was somewhat unique. We got a sewing machine, and we taught ourselves to sew, because nobody else was doing so. And we would design and make these absolutely gorgeous gowns for Barbies that we had stolen from our sisters. And one day, I created my masterpiece. I decided that it was my big chance to share a little bit about myself with my parents. And that went great. I showed my mom, who was my fashion icon at the time, and I showed her this beautiful gown that I had designed and sewed. I don't recall any particular negative reaction from her. I honestly don't think she knew what to say. But then, my dad found out, and boy, did that not go good. He went off the deep end. I was forbidden to ever see Stephen again, and I didn't. I never saw him once after that. My father said that spending time with Stephen would make me gay. If he only knew that I would grow up to be a lesbian trans woman, well, that's another story. But I genuinely believe he would have been supportive if he had the opportunity, but by the time that I had transitioned, he had late-stage dementia and was just incapable of understanding. I remember in the hospital when he was passing, He had no idea who I was, and my brother was making jokes that he thought I was the pretty new nurse, and that was kind of weird, actually. And my mother was very supportive when I did come out, but none of that did me any favors back then. It all validated all of my deepest, darkest fears, that if anybody ever found out about my little secret, nobody would ever love me, I'd lose all my friends, I'd lose all my family, I'd never amount to anything, and I'd die alone. Which is obviously completely untrue, but when you're 12 years old, it seems really easy to believe. And this sent me on a spiral deeply, deeply back into the closet. So no, I wasn't socialized male. I was psychologically and emotionally traumatized. And this narrative paints that as some sort of privilege. It would take another 15 years before my second attempt at coming out, and that frankly didn't go much better than the first one. It wasn't until I felt the need to tell my wife about my history of gender dysphoria before we got married because I felt that she had the right to know. And while she and I have a complicated relationship, it was her grace in that moment that saved me. But she had some conditions. If she was going to accept me, I had to accept myself. I had to drop the shame like a bag of bricks. I had to immediately start gender therapy. And I had to figure out exactly how far I needed to go in order to feel whole and go there. And as you can see, that rabbit hole went fairly deep. It's worth noting that my transition didn't end that marriage. The shame did, and the insecurity that came from it. I asked her not to share what she was going through with her friends and family, and in the process, I deprived her of the social support system that she needed to process what she was going through. I was wrong, and I strongly recommend against doing that. But all I really needed was one person who loved me to accept me, and it was so easy to just drop that lifetime of shame. It just evaporated. And between that shame and the physical pain that I had to endure to undo the testosterone pollution from my first puberty, this is why it's so important to support trans youth. Until recent attacks, trans youth finally had access to the support and services they need to avoid this cycle. So when you don't support your trans child, know that you're signing them up for a lifetime of psychological torture, and if they're lucky enough to survive that, excruciating physical pain to a transition in adulthood. And it's almost entirely avoidable. If Stephen and I had access to the services that kids had today, we may have lived much richer lives. Now, I want to talk about privilege on the other hand. As I grew up, it's impossible not to recognize that, despite my identity, being perceived as male did in fact grant me a significant amount of privilege. And I'm going to be talking extensively about this in the future. Since that time, I've been essayed multiple times. I feel the need to carry a police taser with me when I leave the house. I've suffered harassment, discrimination, retaliation. I mean, just going to the doctor and not being taken seriously. I mean, I could write an entire episode about that. Believe it or not, it didn't used to be like that. So that's real. And where privilege is concerned, perception does become reality. And when losing male privilege, straight privilege, cis privilege, it all becomes so palpable you can taste it, it forces an internal dialogue on what other privilege you might have. For example, it's a fairly common cited statistic to say that trans women are nearly 4 times more likely than cis women to be the victims of violent crime. But when you peel back the onion, things like the 2024 Human Rights Campaign survey show that the absolute vast majority of those victims are trans women of color. It's not even close. And then if you consider that only 15% of America is black, these numbers start to paint an absolutely terrifying picture. And while that's not my story to tell, what I will say is that it's incumbent upon all of us to acknowledge the intersectionality of these issues. Now, while we're on privilege, I've noticed another trend recently within the community that I want to speak to in the gentlest and most delicate way possible. I've seen some creators, who I won't name because it's not my style, and the intent of this is more, not less, solidarity. But it's been essentially trans women who transitioned as youth, coming down on older trans women who transitioned in adulthood for being somehow less than for having experienced male privilege. And I just want to invite you for a moment to reflect on who actually fought for your ability to transition as a child specifically so that you wouldn't need to endure the trauma that I just described. What I think is that there's actually a real opportunity for more grace and a little more gratitude towards the generations that came before that provided the opportunities that we're talking about here. And another thing to consider, particularly for the queer and lesbian trans girlies amongst us, is how different things were back then. For one, we didn't have self-identification or even a depathologized gender dysphoria diagnosis. We had a fully pathologized gender identity disorder, and it was considered a mental illness. But it actually gets much worse, because it was brought to us by Ray Blanchard and Ken Zucker of what is now the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, Canada. And these two contributed heavily to the gender identity disorder criteria in the DSM-4. Thank God that's gone now, but these two have long been debunked and disgraced. But let me walk you through some of the nuances of what we were navigating back then. Ken Zucker's work focused on children, and it was centered around conversion therapy. That sounds fun, right? Blanchard's work was equally damaging. But unlike today, where we know that gender identity and sexuality are completely different things, Blanchard actually used sexuality as the litmus test for who was trans enough and who wasn't. If you were attracted to men, he would describe you as a homosexual transsexual, which in itself is misgendering, but after some heavy gatekeeping, you might have had the opportunity to transition and live your life in peace. However, if you were attracted to women, this is where things get really, really ugly. What we would call a lesbian trans woman today, Blanchard would classify as an autogynephilic transsexual. Your entire identity was reduced to a paraphilia, and one specifically of you being aroused by the image of yourself as a woman. The gatekeeping on this case was more like trying to climb Mount Everest without a Sherpa, and the messaging was absolutely clear. There is something wrong with you. Fortunately, unlike transphobes, science learns, evolves, and grows. So my point is, as a community, I think we've had enough of old, straight, cis, white dudes telling us who's trans and who's not. So let's not do that to each other. We're all in this current shit show together, and with the recent rollbacks on gender-affirming care for kids, we need to do it all over again. And the one thing that's going to allow us to do that is the contrast in experience between trans people who were afforded the liberty to transition in childhood and those who weren't. And I invite you all to let the comment section reflect the unity that I just pitched. I know we're all exhausted from the past couple of years and we seem to be taking shots at each other, but I think as a community we can do a better job in recognizing and even celebrating the diversity of our experiences. But going back to losing male privilege, it was worse than I thought it was going to be. But I also didn't realize how good it was going to be. I mean, I could talk for hours about the magic of female friendships, and I'm sure I will at some point. If men had any idea how rewarding the joys of friendship, grounded in things like emotional availability, emotional maturity, vulnerability, honesty, well, most of the time anyhow, the male loneliness epidemic, it would solve itself overnight. But to say that we were socialized male actually trivializes a phenomenon that leads to many trans people taking their own lives. And when you reduce our experience to, oh, she can never be a woman because she was socialized male, not only are you misrepresenting the situation, but you're actually discrediting a group of women who are uniquely positioned to shed light on some of the root causes of the worst of male behavior. And this is why so many trans women are so unapologetically feminist. And these two phenomena, being the victim of an attempted male socialization, which we'll call the backstage pass to the toxic masculinity starter kit, as well as losing male privilege and all that revealed, that's what forms the lens through which this show will be exploring intersectional feminist issues. Thanks for joining. Please like and subscribe, and be nice to your sisters in the comment section. I'm serious. I'm Katrina King, and this has been The View from Her Side.